The moment Marcus Blackwood's voice echoed through the marble foyer, demanding to know why his 5-year-old nephew was crying again, Brianna Chun felt her stomach drop. She had been working as a nanny for the Blackwood estate for 8 months, practically invisible to the tech billionaire who treated her like another piece of expensive furniture that occasionally needed maintenance. Her 28 years of life experience, including raising her own 7-year-old son Danny as a single mother, meant nothing to a man who measured worth in stock portfolios and board meetings. Brianna had taken the position out of desperation after losing her previous job at a daycare center that closed due to budget cuts. The Blackwood estate paid 3 times what she had earned before, enough to cover Danny's medical bills for his chronic asthma and still have money left for their tiny apartment in Queens. She worked 6 days a week caring for little Oliver Blackwood, whose parents had died in a car accident the previous year, leaving him in the reluctant custody of his uncle Marcus. The 34-year-old billionaire had built his empire on artificial intelligence and machine learning. But when it came to understanding a grieving child, he was completely lost. Brianna watched him interact with Oliver like the boy was a malfunctioning computer program that needed debugging rather than a traumatized little human who desperately needed love and stability. Marcus would stride through the house in his perfectly tailored suits, barking orders at his assistant while barely acknowledging the child who followed him around like a lost puppy. Every morning, Brianna arrived at the imposing Westchester mansion at 7 sharp, taking the train from Queens and then a bus to reach the gates that separated the wealthy from everyone else. She would find Oliver already awake, having had another nightmare about his parents, and spend the first hour of each day helping him process emotions that his uncle seemed incapable of understanding. Her background in child psychology, a degree she had earned while working multiple jobs and raising Danny alone, went completely unnoticed by the Blackwood household staff who saw her only as hired help. The other employees treated her with polite distance, recognizing the class divide that separated the educated nanny from the rest of the domestic staff, but also understanding that she was still just another worker in Marcus Blackwood's empire. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, occasionally made snide comments about how Oliver was becoming too attached to Brianna, as if loving care from a caregiver was somehow inappropriate. The estate manager, James, barely acknowledged her existence except to hand her paychecks and remind her about household rules. What none of them knew was that Brianna had spent 4 years studying child development and trauma response before financial pressures forced her to drop out just 6 credits short of her master's degree. She had planned to become a child psychologist, specializing in helping kids process grief and loss. But Danny's father had abandoned them when their son was diagnosed with severe asthma. The medical bills and single motherhood had derailed her academic dreams, forcing her into a series of childcare jobs that paid the bills but never utilized her extensive knowledge of child psychology. She recognized the signs of complex grief in Oliver immediately, the way he hoarded food at meals, his obsessive need to know exactly when she would return each day, his regression to baby talk when he felt overwhelmed. These were textbook responses to sudden parental loss, compounded by the emotional unavailability of his new guardian. Brianna had seen it dozens of times in her previous work, but here she was expected to simply keep the child quiet and out of Marcus's way. The mansion itself felt more like a museum than a home, with its cold marble surfaces and abstract art that meant nothing to a 5-year-old who just wanted someone to read him bedtime stories. Oliver's room was a shrine to expensive toys that he rarely played with, preferring instead to create elaborate scenarios with cardboard boxes and his imagination. Brianna encouraged this creativity, understanding that play therapy was crucial for processing trauma, but she had to be careful not to let Marcus see the mess they created together. She had learned to read Marcus's moods from the sound of his footsteps on the marble floors. Heavy, quick steps meant he was agitated about business and would be especially short with anyone who crossed his path. Slow, deliberate steps usually meant he was on an important phone call and expected absolute silence throughout the house. The rare occasions when he walked normally often preceded his brief, awkward attempts to interact with Oliver, stilted conversations about school or mechanical inquiries, about whether the boy needed anything. What frustrated Brianna most was watching Oliver's desperate attempts to gain his uncle's attention and approval. The child had started mimicking Marcus's business language, using words like quarterly projections and market optimization that he couldn't possibly understand, hoping to bridge the gap between his world and his uncle's. It broke her heart to see such sophisticated emotional intelligence in a 5-year-old who was essentially raising himself emotionally while surrounded by luxury. Her own son Danny provided a stark contrast to Oliver's isolation. Despite their modest means, Danny was confident and secure in his mother's love, never doubting that he was her top priority. When she picked him up from his after-school program each evening, his face would light up with genuine joy, and they would spend their evenings talking about his day while she helped with homework and prepared simple but nutritious meals. The difference in the two boys' emotional well-being was like comparing a thriving garden to a wilting plant in an ornate but sterile greenhouse. During her lunch breaks, Brianna would often sit in the estate's elaborate garden, eating the sandwich she had packed from home while mentally cataloging all the interventions Oliver needed but would never receive. She knew exactly how to help him process his grief, how to build his confidence, how to create the emotional safety net that every child deserved. But her role was simply to supervise and entertain, not to provide the therapeutic guidance that her education and instincts told her was desperately needed. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was living between two worlds, spending her days in a mansion worth more than she would earn in several lifetimes, then returning each evening to her cramped but love-filled apartment where she gave her own son the emotional attention that Oliver craved. She was good enough to care for a billionaire's nephew, but not valued enough for her expertise to matter. That was about to change in ways none of them could imagine. 3 weeks after Oliver had started kindergarten at the exclusive private school that cost more than Brianna's annual salary, the calls from his teacher began. Mrs. Hamilton, a stern woman in her 50s who had taught children of Manhattan's elite for decades, was reporting behavioral issues that Marcus dismissed as typical adjustment problems. But Brianna knew better. She recognized the signs of a child whose grief was manifesting in ways that traditional discipline couldn't address. Oliver had been acting out during recess, getting into fights with classmates over seemingly minor issues. The school's reports described him as aggressive and defiant, but when Brianna asked gentle questions, she discovered the real triggers. A classmate had made an innocent comment about fathers picking up kids after school, sending Oliver into a rage he couldn't articulate. Another incident occurred when the class was making Father's Day cards, and Oliver had torn his up and thrown it at another student. The child's sleep had become increasingly disrupted, with nightmares occurring almost nightly. Brianna would hear him crying through the monitor system and would quietly slip into his room to comfort him. But she had to be careful not to let Marcus know about these midnight interventions. The billionaire had made it clear that Oliver needed to toughen up and learn independence, viewing emotional support as a sign of weakness that would handicap the boy in the future. Marcus's response to the school reports was characteristically clinical. He scheduled a meeting with the headmaster and came home that evening with a folder full of information about boarding schools that specialized in difficult children. The idea of sending Oliver away made Brianna's heart race with anxiety, but she had no official say in the decision. She was just the nanny, expected to follow instructions and keep her opinions to herself. What made the situation more complex was that Brianna was beginning to see patterns in Marcus's own behavior that suggested his emotional unavailability wasn't just about being busy or uncaring. She noticed how he flinched when Oliver reached for his hand, how he would leave the room when the child became emotional, how he seemed genuinely confused by normal childhood needs for affection and reassurance. Her psychology training recognized the signs of someone who had never learned healthy emotional regulation himself. She began paying closer attention to the family photographs scattered throughout the mansion, noticing that even in childhood pictures, Marcus appeared stiff and formal next to his more relaxed siblings. His relationship with Oliver's father had been complicated. According to fragments of conversation she had overheard from the household staff, the brothers had been competitive rather than close, and Marcus had been traveling for business when the accident occurred, adding a layer of guilt to his grief that he seemed unable to process. The pressure was mounting from all sides. Mrs. Patterson had started making pointed comments about Oliver's disruption of the household routine, suggesting that perhaps a more structured environment would be better for everyone. The estate manager had begun dropping hints about boarding school brochures he had seen on Marcus's desk. Even Oliver's expensive private tutors were recommending that he be evaluated by a behavioral specialist, not understanding that his acting out was a normal response to abnormal circumstances. Brianna found herself walking a tightrope between advocating for Oliver's emotional needs and maintaining her position in a household where challenging the billionaire's decisions could cost her the job she desperately needed. She had started working overtime without pay, staying late to help Oliver with homework and emotional regulation techniques disguised as games. But she couldn't provide the consistent therapeutic intervention he really needed without Marcus's support. Her frustration grew as she watched Oliver's teacher recommend medication for what they labeled as ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder, when she knew the real issue was unresolved grief trauma. The school psychologist's assessment completely missed the underlying causes of his behavior, focusing on symptoms rather than root causes. Brianna had the knowledge to help, but not the authority to implement real solutions. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult evening when Oliver had a complete meltdown over a broken toy. Instead of the comfort he needed, Marcus stormed into the playroom and delivered a lecture about replacing broken items and not crying over material possessions. The child's sobs grew louder, and Marcus's frustration escalated until he was essentially yelling at a traumatized 5-year-old for having normal emotional responses. Brianna had to bite her tongue to keep from intervening directly, but she managed to catch Marcus's attention with a gentle suggestion about helping Oliver clean up the broken pieces together as a calming activity. Her intervention worked. The physical task gave Oliver something concrete to focus on while processing his emotions, but Marcus dismissed the success as coincidence rather than recognizing the therapeutic technique she had employed. That night, after Marcus had retreated to his study to work and Oliver had finally fallen asleep, Brianna sat in the mansion's kitchen writing detailed notes about the child's behavioral patterns and emotional needs. She had been documenting everything for weeks, hoping for an opportunity to present a comprehensive assessment that might change Marcus's approach to his nephew's care. But she knew that speaking up could be seen as overstepping her bounds, potentially costing her the job that kept her own son fed and medically insured. The household staff had begun to notice her after-hours activities, and she could sense their curiosity about why she spent so much time observing and documenting Oliver's behavior. Some seemed supportive of her obvious dedication to the child, while others appeared suspicious of her motives. The divide was creating tension in the usually smoothly run household. With everyone aware that something was building toward a confrontation, what none of them realized was that Brianna's careful documentation and behavioral analysis was far more sophisticated than anything the expensive private school or hired specialists had produced. Her academic background and practical experience had given her insights into Oliver's psychological state that could transform his trajectory from troubled child to thriving individual. She just needed someone to listen. And the stubborn billionaire who controlled every aspect of the household showed no signs of recognizing her expertise. The phone call that changed everything came on a rainy Tuesday morning in November. Mrs. Hamilton's voice was crisp and professional as she informed Marcus that Oliver had been suspended from school for 3 days following an incident where he had bitten another child during lunch. The headmaster wanted to schedule an immediate conference to discuss whether the prestigious academy was the right fit for a child with such severe behavioral issues. Marcus's reaction was swift and decisive in all the wrong ways. He canceled 2 important business meetings and stormed into the mansion like a man whose carefully controlled world was falling apart. Brianna watched from the top of the marble staircase as he paced the foyer, speaking in clipped tones to his assistant about finding the best behavioral specialist in the country and researching military-style boarding schools that specialized in discipline. Oliver, meanwhile, had spent the car ride home from school in complete silence, his small face streaked with tears he was too exhausted to shed anymore. When Marcus demanded an explanation for the biting incident, the child simply stared at his expensive shoes and mumbled that he didn't know why he had done it. The billionaire's frustration was palpable as he struggled to understand how a 5-year-old could be so deliberately destructive to his own future. What Marcus didn't know, what he had never bothered to learn, was that the biting incident had been triggered by a classmate's innocent question about where Oliver's parents were during the school's family volunteer day. The child had tried to explain that his parents were in heaven but had become overwhelmed when pressed for details about when they would return. In his confusion and distress, he had lashed out physically because he lacked the emotional vocabulary to express his pain. Brianna knew all of this because she had developed the patience to listen to Oliver's fragmented explanations and piece together the real story behind his behavior. She understood that his aggression wasn't defiance but rather a 5-year-old's attempt to protect himself from emotional pain he couldn't process. But when she tried to gently suggest that they discuss what had happened at school, Marcus cut her off with a sharp reminder that her job was childcare, not psychology. The suspension meant that Oliver would be home during business hours, disrupting Marcus's carefully structured routine and forcing him to confront the reality of his nephew's emotional state. For 3 days, he would be unable to maintain the comfortable distance that allowed him to provide financial support without emotional investment. The prospect clearly terrified him more than any corporate crises he had ever faced. By the 2nd day of suspension, the tension in the mansion was suffocating. Marcus had hired an expensive behavioral consultant who arrived with clipboards and assessment forms, treating Oliver like a case study rather than a grieving child. The specialist spent 45 minutes asking clinical questions that Oliver answered with increasingly monosyllabic responses, then delivered a diagnosis of severe behavioral disorder with oppositional tendencies that recommended immediate pharmaceutical intervention. Brianna watched this unfold with growing anger and frustration, knowing that the consultant had completely missed the obvious signs of grief trauma that any competent child psychologist would recognize immediately. The recommended medication would suppress Oliver's symptoms without addressing their underlying causes, potentially causing more harm than good to his developing brain and emotional processing abilities. That evening, after the consultant had left with a prescription and a recommendation for residential therapeutic treatment, Brianna found herself alone with Oliver in his bedroom. The child was quietly playing with wooden blocks, building and rebuilding the same tower over and over again, a repetitive behavior that she recognized as a self-soothing mechanism. He looked up at her with enormous brown eyes and asked if he was broken, like his favorite toy car that Marcus had thrown away because it couldn't be fixed. The question broke something inside Brianna's carefully maintained professional composure. She knelt beside Oliver and gently explained that he wasn't broken at all, that his feelings were normal and healthy responses to losing his parents. She used simple language to help him understand that his anger and sadness were his heart's way of showing how much he had loved his mom and dad. For the first time in weeks, she saw genuine relief in his small face as someone finally validated his emotional experience. But their conversation was interrupted by Marcus's footsteps in the hallway. Brianna quickly returned to organizing Oliver's clothes while the billionaire appeared in the doorway, looking haggard and frustrated. He announced that he had made a decision. Oliver would be enrolled in a residential treatment facility in Connecticut that specialized in troubled children from affluent families. The boy would start there the following week, allowing Marcus to focus on his business without the constant disruption of behavioral crises. The news hit Brianna like a physical blow. She knew that sending Oliver away would destroy the small foundation of trust and security she had been carefully building with him over the past 8 months. A residential facility would separate him from the one adult in his life who understood his emotional needs, likely setting back his healing process by years. But Marcus presented the decision as final and non-negotiable. The solution to a problem that was interfering with his real priorities. Oliver's reaction to the news was devastating. Rather than the explosive anger that had characterized his recent behavior, he simply went silent and stopped eating. He would sit at the enormous dining room table picking at meals prepared by the estate's chef, his small body seeming to shrink into itself with defeat. The spark of curiosity and creativity that Brianna had been nurturing was extinguished as he retreated into the protective shell that traumatized children build around themselves. Mrs. Patterson and the other household staff seemed relieved by Marcus's decision, viewing Oliver's removal as a return to the peaceful efficiency they preferred. But Brianna could see the tragic irony of a billionaire who could solve complex technological problems worth millions of dollars, but couldn't recognize that his nephew simply needed love, patience, and proper therapeutic support. The solution was so simple, yet so completely invisible to everyone in power. As the week progressed and arrangements were made for Oliver's departure, Brianna found herself facing an impossible choice. She could remain silent and keep her job, watching as a brilliant, sensitive child is essentially abandoned by the only family he had left. Or she could risk everything by speaking up, using her expertise to challenge Marcus's decision in a way that would likely cost her the income her own son depended on for his medical care. The weight of that decision was crushing her. But she knew that her moment to act was running out. Oliver's bags were already packed, and the residential facility was expecting him the following Monday. If she was going to intervene, it would have to be soon, and it would have to be dramatic enough to cut through Marcus Blackwood's emotional barriers and force him to see what was really happening to his nephew. The Friday before Oliver was scheduled to leave for the residential facility, everything fell apart in spectacular fashion. Marcus had arranged for a final psychological evaluation to satisfy the treatment center's admission requirements, bringing in Dr. Richard Steinberg, a renowned child psychiatrist whose client list read like a who's who of Manhattan's elite families. The doctor arrived at the mansion with an air of clinical authority that immediately set Oliver on edge. Dr. Steinberg's approach was textbook institutional psychology, formal assessments, standardized tests, and a series of questions designed to diagnose pathology rather than understand the child's emotional experience. He set up his evaluation materials in Marcus's study. transforming the already intimidating space into something that felt more like an interrogation room than a place for healing. Oliver took one look at the sterile testing environment and began to shut down completely. Brianna was relegated to the role of silent observer, instructed to remain in the room but not to interfere with the evaluation process. She watched in growing horror as Dr. Steinberg attempted to engage. Oliver, with the same clinical detachment she had seen destroy children's trust in therapeutic relationships countless times before. The psychiatrist's questions were leading and diagnostic rather than exploratory, clearly designed to confirm a predetermined conclusion rather than understand Oliver's unique situation. When Oliver refused to complete a puzzle that Dr. Steinberg described as a cognitive assessment tool, the psychiatrist noted defiant behavior and oppositional responses to authority. When the child became upset and asked for Brianna, the doctor interpreted this as inappropriate attachment to service personnel and inability to respect professional boundaries. Every normal response to stress was being pathologized and documented as evidence of serious behavioral disorders. The breaking point came when Dr. Steinberg asked Oliver to draw a picture of his family. The child spent nearly 20 minutes creating a careful drawing that showed his parents as angels floating above a house, with himself standing alone in the doorway. It was a heartbreakingly accurate representation of his emotional reality, the awareness that his parents were gone forever, combined with his profound sense of isolation and abandonment. But Dr. Steinberg interpreted the drawing completely differently. He pointed to the angels and made notes about fantasy thinking and inability to accept reality. He questioned Oliver aggressively about why he had drawn himself alone, suggesting that this indicated antisocial tendencies and rejection of available support systems. The child became increasingly distressed as the psychiatrist essentially criticized his honest emotional expression as pathological. Marcus observed this evaluation with visible satisfaction, clearly viewing Dr. Steinberg's harsh assessment as validation of his decision to send Oliver away. When the psychiatrist recommended immediate residential treatment combined with aggressive pharmaceutical intervention, the billionaire nodded approvingly and began discussing logistics for the transfer. Oliver sat silently through this conversation about his future, his small hands clenched in his lap as adults decided his fate without any consideration for his feelings. Brianna felt something snap inside her chest as she watched this travesty unfold. Every instinct she had developed through years of education and experience was screaming that these men were about to destroy a vulnerable child's chance for healthy emotional development. The evaluation was not just wrong, it was actively harmful, pathologizing normal grief responses and recommending interventions that would traumatize Oliver further. When Dr. Steinberg finished his assessment and recommended immediate pharmaceutical treatment for what he diagnosed as severe ADHD with oppositional defiant disorder and possible early-onset conduct disorder, Brianna couldn't remain silent anymore. She watched Marcus write a check for the evaluation and listened to them discuss medication dosages for a 5-year-old whose only real problem was that no one understood how to help him grieve. That evening, after Dr. Steinberg had left with his damning report and Marcus had retreated to his study to finalize arrangements with the residential facility, Brianna found Oliver hiding in his walk-in closet. The child had built a small fort out of blankets and was clutching a photograph of his parents, rocking back and forth in a self-soothing motion that broke her heart. When he looked up at her with tear-filled eyes and asked if he was crazy like the doctor had said, she knew she couldn't stand by any longer. For the first time since taking the job, Brianna allowed herself to speak from her expertise rather than her assigned role. She gathered Oliver in her arms and explained in age-appropriate language that he wasn't crazy at all, that his feelings were completely normal for someone who had lost their parents. She told him about grief and trauma and how different people needed different kinds of help to feel better. Most importantly, she assured him that his sadness and anger were proof of how much love he had in his heart, not signs that anything was wrong with him. But their moment of connection was interrupted by Marcus's voice from the doorway. The billionaire had been looking for Oliver to discuss the next day's departure arrangements and had overheard enough of Brianna's explanation to realize that she was directly contradicting the professional assessment he had just paid thousands of dollars to obtain. His face was cold with anger as he demanded to know by what authority she was questioning Dr. Steinberg's expert diagnosis. The confrontation that followed was everything Brianna had been dreading and anticipating for months. Marcus accused her of overstepping her boundaries, of filling Oliver's head with ideas that contradicted professional medical advice, and of undermining the treatment plan that had been carefully designed by qualified experts. He reminded her that she was just a nanny, not a doctor, and that her job was to follow instructions rather than question decisions made by her betters. Brianna felt 8 months of frustration and professional outrage boiling over as she listened to Marcus dismiss her expertise and concern for Oliver's well-being. She had watched this man systematically fail to understand his nephew's basic emotional needs while surrounding himself with expensive consultants who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what the child actually needed. The injustice of it all, the waste of a brilliant child's potential, finally pushed her past her ability to remain diplomatically silent. Standing in that opulent closet with Oliver still clinging to her arms, Brianna made a decision that would change everything. She looked directly at Marcus Blackwood and told him that he was wrong, that Dr. Steinberg was wrong, and that sending Oliver away would be the biggest mistake of both their lives. She had kept quiet long enough, and she would not watch them destroy a child she had come to love just because they were too emotionally stunted to recognize what he really needed. The silence that followed her declaration was deafening. Marcus stared at her with complete shock, clearly unable to process the fact that his employee had just challenged not only his authority, but his judgment as Oliver's guardian. The dynamic between them had shifted irrevocably, and there was no going back to the comfortable distance that had defined their relationship. Everything was about to change. The confrontation in Oliver's closet had awakened something fierce and protective in Brianna that she couldn't suppress any longer. As Marcus stared at her in shock, she gently moved Oliver to his bed and turned to face the billionaire with 8 months of professional observations burning in her chest. For the first time since taking the job, she spoke with the authority of her education and experience rather than the deference of hired help. She began by systematically dismantling Dr. Steinberg's assessment, using clinical terminology that clearly surprised Marcus with its sophistication. She explained how the psychiatrist had failed to account for developmental trauma responses, how his diagnostic criteria ignored the normal progression of childhood grief, and how his recommended interventions would likely cause additional psychological harm to an already vulnerable child. Her analysis was precise, thorough, and delivered with the confidence of someone who actually understood child psychology. Marcus's initial anger began to shift to confusion as Brianna demonstrated knowledge that he hadn't expected from someone he had categorized as simple childcare staff. When she referenced specific studies on childhood trauma recovery and cited recent research on attachment theory, he found himself listening despite his resentment at being challenged. The depth of her understanding was undeniable, even if he wasn't ready to acknowledge that he might have been wrong about her capabilities. She pulled out a folder she had been keeping hidden in her bag for months, detailed behavioral charts, emotional progression notes, and developmental assessments that tracked Oliver's responses to different interventions she had quietly implemented. The documentation was more comprehensive than anything Dr. Steinberg had produced in his single evaluation session. showing patterns and insights that could only come from careful, daily observation combined with professional training. The charts revealed a completely different picture of Oliver's emotional state than the one painted by the expensive consultant. Brianna had documented how the child's aggressive behavior consistently occurred in response to specific triggers related to his parents' death, how his defiance was actually sophisticated self-advocacy when he felt misunderstood, and how his inability to attach was really a desperate hunger for consistent emotional support that had been systematically denied. Most compelling were her records of interventions that had worked. Simple changes to Oliver's routine, therapeutic play techniques disguised as games, and emotional validation strategies had produced dramatic improvements in his behavior and mood. The data showed clear evidence that with proper support, Oliver was not only capable of healing, but was actually a remarkably resilient and emotionally intelligent child whose responses to trauma were completely normal. Marcus found himself reluctantly impressed by the sophistication of Brianna's analysis. But his pride prevented him from immediately acknowledging that she might be right. Instead, he questioned her qualifications to make such assessments, demanding to know where she had learned to conduct psychological evaluations and create therapeutic interventions. His tone was still challenging, but Brianna could hear genuine curiosity beneath the defensive anger. That's when she revealed the extent of her hidden qualifications. She explained her educational background in child psychology, her near completion of a master's degree in trauma therapy, and her years of experience working with grieving children before financial necessity forced her into basic childcare positions. The revelation that his simple nanny had more relevant expertise than the expensive consultant he had hired was clearly difficult for Marcus to process. She showed him examples of therapeutic techniques she had been using with Oliver, explaining how art therapy, play therapy, and narrative therapy could help children process complex emotions that they couldn't express verbally. Each technique had been carefully adapted to Oliver's specific needs and implemented subtly enough that Marcus had never noticed the clinical sophistication of her interactions with his nephew. The breakthrough moment came when Brianna pulled out her phone and showed Marcus's a video she had recorded the previous week of Oliver, engaged in what appeared to be simple play, but was actually a sophisticated therapeutic exercise. In the video, the child was building elaborate block structures while narrating stories about a little boy who missed his parents but learned to be brave. The emotional processing happening in real time was undeniable. And Marcus could see for himself how skilled therapeutic intervention looked completely different from the clinical interrogation Dr. Steinberg had conducted. As the evidence mounted, Marcus began to understand the magnitude of his mistakes. He had been so focused on finding someone to fix Oliver's problems that he had completely overlooked the fact that the solution had been working in his house for 8 months. Brianna hadn't just been babysitting his nephew. She had been conducting sophisticated trauma therapy that was actually helping the child heal. The realization was devastating to his self-image as someone who could solve any problem with enough money and expert consultation. He had spent tens of thousands of dollars on assessments and treatment plans that were inferior to the intervention his 20-8-year-old nanny had been providing for free. The bruise to his ego was enormous, but the implications for Oliver's well-being were even more significant. Brianna pressed her advantage by explaining what real therapeutic intervention would look like for Oliver. Not the institutional approach of residential treatment, but comprehensive trauma therapy combined with family counseling that addressed the entire household's emotional dynamics. She outlined a treatment plan that would keep Oliver home while providing him with the support he needed to process his grief and develop healthy coping mechanisms. For the first time in their 8-month relationship, Marcus found himself asking Brianna questions rather than giving her orders. He wanted to understand how she had learned to read Oliver's emotional needs so accurately, how she had developed interventions that worked when expensive professionals had failed, and most importantly, what it would take to help his nephew heal from the trauma that everyone else seemed determined to pathologize rather than treat. The conversation continued past midnight as Brianna shared insights about Oliver's emotional development that Marcus had never considered. She explained how his nephew's intelligence and sensitivity were actually assets in his recovery process, how his strong emotional responses indicated healthy attachment capacity, and how his behavioral problems were really sophisticated attempts to communicate needs that no one had bothered to understand. By the time their discussion ended, the dynamic between them had been completely transformed. Marcus was no longer the condescending employer dismissing his nanny's opinions, and Brianna was no longer the invisible caregiver hiding her expertise to keep her job. They had become collaborators in Oliver's healing process, with Marcus finally recognizing that the help his nephew needed had been available all along. The Monday morning that Oliver was supposed to leave for residential treatment, Marcus Blackwood made the most important phone call of his nephew's young life. Instead of confirming transportation arrangements to the Connecticut facility, he contacted Dr. Steinberg to cancel the placement and inform him that they would be pursuing a different treatment approach. The psychiatrist's condescending lecture about inexperienced guardians and emotional decision-making only reinforced Marcus's growing certainty that he had nearly made a catastrophic mistake. Oliver's relief when Marcus explained that he wouldn't be leaving was profound and immediate. The child threw his arms around his uncle's legs, the first spontaneous physical affection he had shown in months, and asked if this meant he could stay with Brianna for the first time. Marcus answered yes without hesitation, understanding finally that the bond between his nephew and his caregiver was therapeutic rather than problematic. The transformation in the household's dynamics was immediate and dramatic. Marcus cleared his schedule for the week and asked Brianna to teach him how to support Oliver's emotional needs rather than simply managing his behavior. The billionaire who could master complex algorithms and market predictions approached learning about childhood trauma with the same methodical intelligence he applied to business problems, but with a humility that was completely new to him. Brianna designed a comprehensive intervention plan that addressed not just Oliver's grief, but the entire family system that had failed to support his healing. She explained to Marcus how his own emotional unavailability had inadvertently reinforced Oliver's sense of abandonment, creating a cycle where the child's increasing desperation for connection triggered the adult's increasing withdrawal. Breaking this pattern required Marcus to confront his own discomfort with emotional intimacy. The first family therapy session Brianna facilitated was awkward and painful, but also revelatory, using techniques she had learned in graduate school. She guided both Marcus and Oliver through exercises designed to improve their communication and emotional connection. She watched as the sophisticated businessman struggled with concepts that came naturally to children, expressing feelings directly, asking for what you need, offering comfort without trying to fix everything. Marcus's corporate instincts initially sabotaged his attempts at emotional availability. When Oliver shared his sadness about missing his parents, Marcus's first response was to offer to buy something that would make him feel better, or to remind him of all the advantages his new life offered. Brianna had to repeatedly redirect him towards simply acknowledging Oliver's feelings and offering presents rather than solutions. But gradually, something shifted in their relationship. Marcus began to recognize that Oliver's emotional needs weren't problems to be solved, but experiences to be shared and supported. He started reading to his nephew at bedtime, not because it was scheduled, but because Oliver enjoyed the closeness. He learned to sit quietly when the child cried, offering comfort through presence rather than attempting to stop the tears that were actually part of healthy grief processing. The changes in Oliver were remarkable and swift once he felt genuinely supported rather than managed. His sleep improved dramatically when his emotional needs were met during waking hours. His behavior at school stabilized as his home environment became a source of security rather than stress. Most importantly, his natural creativity and intelligence began to flourish as he no longer had to spend his energy on basic emotional survival. Brianna documented every step of their progress, creating a comprehensive case study that demonstrated how proper therapeutic intervention could transform a severely disturbed child into a thriving, well-adjusted individual in a matter of weeks. The contrast with Dr. Steinberg's assessment was so stark that Marcus began to question how many other children might be misdiagnosed and mistreated by professionals who prioritized pathology over understanding. The household staff noticed the transformation immediately. Mrs. Patterson commented that she had never seen the mansion. Feels so much like a home, with actual laughter echoing through the marble hallways. James observed that Marcus seemed more relaxed and focused, as if resolving his family crisis had freed up mental energy for his business concerns. Even the groundskeeping staff mentioned that Oliver had started spending time in the gardens, building fairy houses and telling elaborate stories about the creatures who might live in them. What surprised everyone most was how much Marcus himself changed through the process of learning to care for Oliver emotionally. The billionaire who had built his empire on logical analysis and emotional detachment discovered that connecting with his nephew required him to develop parts of himself that he had long suppressed. He became more patient, more intuitive, and paradoxically more effective in his business dealings as his emotional intelligence expanded. Brianna's role in the household evolved from invisible caregiver to essential family therapist and consultant. Marcus insisted on giving her a substantial raise and formally recognizing her educational credentials. But more importantly, he began treating her as a professional colleague whose expertise was crucial to his nephew's well-being. The class barriers that had defined their relationship dissolved as they worked together toward a common goal. The most powerful moment came 6 weeks into their new approach, when Oliver spontaneously created a drawing that showed his parents as angels watching over a house where he stood with Marcus and Brianna, all of them smiling. The image was still touched with sadness, but it also radiated security and hope. When he presented it to Marcus, the billionaire actually teared up, the first genuine emotional response Oliver had ever witnessed from his uncle. That drawing went on Marcus's office wall, replacing one of his expensive abstract pieces. It became a reminder of what really mattered and how close he had come to destroying the most important relationship in his life through ignorance and emotional avoidance. But it also represented the beginning of a new chapter for their family, one built on understanding rather than management, connection rather than control. The transformation was so complete that when Dr. Steinberg called to check on Oliver's adjustment to residential treatment, Marcus found himself explaining with pride how his nephew was thriving at home with proper support. The psychiatrist's skepticism and condescension only highlighted how much Marcus's perspective had changed. He no longer needed external validation of his family decisions from professionals who didn't understand his unique situation. As Oliver's healing progressed and their family dynamic stabilized, Marcus began to understand that the crisis had been a gift in disguise. It had forced him to confront his own emotional limitations and had brought Brianna's expertise into their lives in a way that would benefit Oliver for years to come. What had started as a crisis threatening to tear their small family apart had ultimately made them stronger and more connected than he had ever thought possible. 6 months after the crisis that nearly sent Oliver to residential treatment, The Blackwood household had become something entirely different from the cold, efficient mansion it had once been. Marcus had converted one of the formal sitting rooms into a family room where he and Oliver spent evenings playing board games, reading together, or simply talking about their days. The marble surfaces were now softened with colorful rugs and comfortable furniture that actually invited human connection rather than displaying wealth. Brianna's official role had expanded far beyond traditional childcare into something resembling a family therapist and child development specialist. Marcus had insisted on creating a formal contract that recognized her advanced training and gave her authority to make decisions about Oliver's therapeutic needs. She now worked 4 days a week with the family while completing her master's degree on Fridays, with Marcus covering her tuition as part of her compensation package. Oliver's transformation was the most dramatic of all. The anxious, angry child who had been biting classmates and having daily meltdowns had become a confident, emotionally articulate boy who could discuss his feelings about his parents' death with remarkable maturity. He still missed them terribly, but he no longer felt alone with his grief. His teachers reported that he was now one of the most empathetic children in his class, often helping other students work through their own emotional challenges. The success of their family therapy model had attracted attention from other wealthy families dealing with similar issues. Marcus found himself fielding calls from parents whose children were struggling with trauma, divorce, or behavioral challenges, all asking for referrals to the miracle worker who had transformed his nephew. He took pride in recommending Brianna's services. Though he was careful to protect her time and ensure that Oliver remained her priority, Brianna had started a small consulting practice, working with affluent families whose children had been misdiagnosed or inadequately treated by traditional psychiatric approaches. Her combination of advanced training and practical experience with high-pressure family dynamics made her uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between therapeutic theory and real-world implementation. She was beginning to build a reputation as someone who could succeed where expensive specialists had failed. The financial security from her expanded role allowed Brianna to finally focus on her own son's needs without the constant stress of medical bills and housing costs. Danny's asthma was better controlled now that they could afford the best treatments, and he was thriving in a new school near Marcus's estate that offered smaller class sizes and more individualized attention. The two boys had become friends, with Oliver often visiting their modest but warm apartment in Queens. Marcus's relationship with his own emotions continued to evolve as he learned to navigate the complexities of parenting a traumatized child. He had started his own therapy to address the emotional patterns that had nearly cost him his relationship with Oliver. The work was difficult and sometimes uncomfortable, but he approached it with the same determination he brought to business challenges. Understanding that his nephew's well-being depended on his own emotional growth, the most significant change was in how Marcus understood success and achievement. Where he had once measured worth purely in financial terms, he now found profound satisfaction in Oliver's emotional development and their growing bond. The child's laughter, his spontaneous hugs, and his increasing ability to trust and connect with others had become more valuable to Marcus than any business acquisition or stock price. The mansion itself reflected their new priorities. The formal dining room was now used for family dinners where conversation flowed naturally and Oliver felt safe to share his thoughts and feelings. The imposing study had been reorganized to include a comfortable reading corner where Marcus and Oliver spent time together each evening. Even the intimidating entryway now featured Oliver's artwork and family photos that showed their genuine affection for each other. Brianna's expertise had extended beyond Oliver's individual healing to transform the entire household's approach to emotional health and family relationships. She had trained the staff to recognize and respond appropriately to childhood emotional needs, creating a supportive environment that reinforced the therapeutic work happening at home. Mrs. Patterson had become one of Oliver's strongest advocates, often remarking that caring for the child was now a joy rather than a burden. The professional recognition Brianna was receiving for her innovative approach to childhood trauma therapy was opening doors she had never imagined possible. She had been invited to speak at conferences about her work with high-functioning families, and several universities had approached her about developing training programs for therapists working with affluent clients. Her near dissertation was being revised for publication, with Marcus's financial support allowing her to focus on research rather than survival. But perhaps most importantly, the crisis had revealed the profound impact that proper therapeutic intervention could have on a child's entire life trajectory. Oliver was now excelling academically, forming healthy friendships, and developing the emotional resilience that would serve him throughout his life. The contrast with what might have happened under residential treatment was stark and sobering, highlighting how many children might be unnecessarily medicated or institutionalized when what they really needed was understanding and appropriate support. As they approached the one-year anniversary of Oliver's near placement in residential care, Marcus often reflected on how close he had come to making an irreversible mistake. His nephew's healing had taught him that the most valuable expertise didn't always come with the highest price tag or the most impressive credentials. Sometimes, the help you needed was already in your life, waiting to be recognized and valued. The future stretched ahead of them with possibilities that hadn't existed before their crises. Oliver was thriving, Marcus was learning to be the guardian his nephew deserved, and Brianna was building the career she had always dreamed of while making a real difference in children's lives. Their unconventional family had found its rhythm, built on a foundation of mutual respect, emotional honesty, and the understanding that healing was possible when the right support was finally offered. Their story had become a testament to the power of recognizing hidden expertise, the importance of emotional intelligence in child-rearing, and the possibility of transformation when pride gave way to genuine care for a child's well-being. As they moved forward together, they carried with them the knowledge that the most important interventions often came not from expensive specialists, but from the people who took the time to truly understand and value the children in their care.